think we're going to get started. Please, though, if you're getting lunch, please do that, and we're going to eat lunch too as we're going through our proceedings. So this is a working lunch, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Energy Policy Outlook, University of Georgia Energy Policy Outlook, which is our first installment, and I hope we'll do many more going forward. This event is a partnership between the Center for International Trade and Security, CITS, which is located within the School of Public and International Affairs, SPIA, of which I'm the Dean. My name is Matt Auer, and I'm joined also by the Dean of the College of Engineering, also co-sponsoring this event, Don Leo. So my friend Don Leo is here somewhere. So the Center for International Trade and Security, CITS, was established in 1987 with the support of former Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Today, it's headed by Dr. Justin Conrad, who's here with us. Faculty and fellows who are associated with CITS train professionals around the world on non-proliferation, strategic trade, and energy security. CITS also serves as a hub of research, teaching, and outreach on new and emerging security topics. The College of Engineering at the University of Georgia was established in 2012, and it's UGA's newest college. Engineering's growth has been phenomenal. Already, it's the fourth largest college among 18 academic units at UGA. Under the leadership of Don Leo, who I mentioned before, we're delighted to partner with engineering to address major challenges in the area of energy and human security. Now I'd like to introduce someone who has incredible respect and perspective on the subjects of energy policy, public infrastructure policy, and workforce development in the state of Georgia and beyond. Public Service Commissioner Tricia Pridemore. Commissioner Pridemore joined the Georgia Public Service Commission in 2018. She was unanimously elected chair of the commission by her fellow commissioners in 2021. In addition to her duties with the commission, she serves on the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC, in a variety of roles. She also is a member of the board of the New Mexico State University Center for Public Utilities and is the vice chair of the board of the Financial Research Institute at the University of Missouri. In 2020, Commissioner Pridemore was appointed to the U.S. Department of Energy and NARUC Natural Gas Partnership. Commissioner Pridemore formerly served as the executive director of the Governor's Office of Workforce Development, and she started Georgia's Skilled Trade Initiative aimed at encouraging careers in energy, transportation, and construction trades. She was also a member of the Cobb Galleria Authority Board of Governors. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Tricia Pridemore.
Thank you, Dean Auer. We are blessed to live in the finest state that God ever created. From beautiful mountains to the magnificent coast and everywhere in between, Georgia is a special place, and our state's energy sector is a major reason for our success. The 5-person statewide elected Georgia Public Service Commission oversees energy and telecommunication utilities. Each and every day, we work to make Georgia the #1 place for business and the #1 place to live, work, and raise a family. Our constructive regulatory environment marries responsible public policy with regulations that balance safety and reliability with affordability. In 2022, the PSC will oversee a Georgia Power Integrated Resource Plan, setting a 20-year strategic plan for electricity, a Georgia Power rate case, expansion of Georgia's natural gas system with Atlanta Gas Light Company and our 18 gas marketers serving our state. And we will also continue our work expanding rural broadband and leveraging our state's assets to connect more Georgians than ever before. The PSC commissioners and staff are proud to serve Georgia. We hope you expand your learning and understanding of this critical sector from today's presenters. Thank you for the opportunity to welcome you, and go Dogs. How about them? Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Gary K. Birch, Director of SPIA's Center for International Trade and Security, Mr. Justin Conrad.
Thank you, Commissioner Pridemore. We really appreciate the Commissioner being here this morning with us to help us kick things off. I'm Justin Conrad. I'm the Director of SITS. I also want to say thank you to all of you who made the trip to be here with us this morning, and also to all of you who are tuning in online. I don't want to hold up the program here, but I did want to just give you some brief context about what you're going to hear today. This is the inaugural UGA Energy Outlook. This is really a culmination of a relationship that's been developing over the last few years between UGA's College of Engineering and the School of Public and International Affairs. And I want to thank Dean Leo from Engineering, who's here with us today, and of course Dean Auer, who you just heard from. Both of them have been tremendously supportive of this initiative, and we very much appreciate that support. All of the work that you're going to hear about today is done at the Center for International Trade and Security, CITS. CITS is really the main hub of activity at UGA on matters of national and international security. It was started back in 1987. Since then, it's become known as a leading source of research and teaching and policy expertise on matters of security, but particularly in three areas: nuclear nonproliferation, human security, and energy security. All of the work that we do at CITS, the work you're going to hear about today, we recognize that a lot of these issues, those three that I just mentioned, but others as well, they are interconnected, they're overlapping. And so, a few decades ago, it might have been okay to talk about all of those issues in isolation from one another, but that's just simply not the case anymore. Our world is far more complex. And so with everything that we do, when we talk about something like energy policy, like we're doing today, we recognize that we can't divorce that from other issues of security, such as climate, agricultural scarcity, natural resources, to things like weapons proliferation, great power competition, which you're going to hear a little bit about today. And so everything that we do takes a very comprehensive approach to understanding an issue like energy security and understanding the implications of our energy decisions at the local, the state, the national levels. As the world moves further away from high carbon energy sources, that means that these issues are only going to impact and affect the lives of people in Georgia even more in the future. So today what you're going to hear is a lot of information. You're going to see a lot of data, and I mean a lot. You're going to get hit with the Dr. Gaddy fire hose here in a few minutes, just fair warning. But we're not here to make policy recommendations. We are simply here. Our goal is to provide Georgia's decision makers and their constituents with the information that you need to successfully navigate the energy challenges of the coming decades. So when you leave here today, I do want to encourage you to check out our website, sits.uga.edu, as well as our social media accounts for updates and information on all the activities that we have going on. To include a energy security conference that we're going to be hosting on campus in April. So look for more information about that soon. But I also do want to encourage you to contact us, to think of us as a resource for any questions or issues that you have related to energy security, energy policy, or security more broadly. With that, let me go ahead and introduce the two people that you're going to hear from most of all today. The first is Dr. Josh Massey, who in addition to being a senior research associate at CITS, is also teaches in the Department of International Affairs at UGA. He's also the director of our Master of International Policy program. And before he came to UGA to do all of that, he served for 23 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. After you hear from Dr. Massey, you'll hear from Dr. David Gaddy, Associate Professor of Engineering, Senior Fellow at CITS, and one of the nation's leading experts on energy security. So these two gentlemen have really been making an impact in recent years, publishing peer-reviewed research, commenting, discussing energy security in national and international media outlets, testifying before Congress, you name it, they've been doing it. So we're very fortunate to be able to nail their feet to the floor here for a short period of time and actually hear about some of the work that they've been doing. So without further ado, Dr. Massey.
Well, thank you, Justin, and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you today. As Justin mentioned, I'm a senior research associate at the Center for International Trade and Security and director of UGA's Master of International Policy program, which is also located in SPIA. Over the course of the past several years, we have had the good fortune of being able to collaborate and partner with David Gaddy and the College of Engineering in an effort to achieve a much more rich and full understanding of the effects of our energy policy. Now, in addition to that work, we've also been focused on training the next generation of energy practitioners. And to that aim, what we have done is began an energy security track in our master's curriculum. Our insight is that we can take policy-oriented students and we can arm them with a technical understanding of our energy systems. Likewise, we can take engineering students and we can arm them with a deep understanding and appreciation for the domestic and international implications of the actions that we propose. Now, all of this to say that it's not lost on us that the discussions and the debates that we are having today are merely the opening act of a debate that is going to remain in the forefront of our politics for years to come. Our belief is that the SPIA College of Engineering partnership is a small, well-placed investment that's going to continue to reap disproportionate benefits for many years to come at the local, at the state, and at the national levels. And so what I want to do this morning is I'm just going to outline the scope of some of the challenges that we currently face in the energy sector. And then very briefly, what I'll introduce is our approach to how we think about those issues. This is a sample of recent headlines within the past year that I just pulled from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. What these headlines reflect is the broad range of issues and the complexity that is embedded within our energy decisions. No doubt you're familiar with many of these. Energy shortages in California and the related threat of blackouts. The threat of climate change and the urgent need for us to reduce our carbon emissions. The near collapse of the power grid in Texas and how that resulted in blackouts and crushing power bills for many of their citizens. Perhaps other headlines you may be less familiar with. Europe's recent energy miscalculations and their growing over-reliance on Russian natural gas. China's dominance in rare earth minerals, minerals that are essential to our renewable industry, and China's willingness to use that dominance as a geopolitical weapon. And so the first challenge that we face is how do we integrate and how do we organize such a wide range of issues? And with that goal in mind, if we take a fresh look at these headlines, what we can see is that generally they fall within three distinct domains. That is, we have economic impacts, we have climate impacts, and there are geopolitical impacts. Now, this slide is just a graphic that I pulled from a website that we're currently developing with our students. But what the slide represents is that as we rotate the energy policy gear, that is, as we make energy policy decisions, the impacts of those decisions do not only impact our energy systems themselves, but by default, we are making economic decisions, we are making climate decisions, and we are making national security decisions. So the common thread that we use to pull these domains together is security. If you think back to the previous slide, the headlines that we showed, what resonates across all of those headlines is the magnitude of the risk that are embedded in our energy decisions. And so for that reason, we elect to look at energy policy through a security lens. The problem that we face is that each of us has a tendency to gravitate towards one of these domains. The value in having a security-centric framework really is twofold. And that is, first of all, it encourages us to recognize the validity of issues that lie across all of the domains that we see: the economic, the climate, and the geopolitical. Second, and perhaps most important, it assists us in guarding against the temptation to fixate on any one issue or any one domain, and remind ourselves that when we tend to focus on a single domain, we create blind spots and gaps in our thinking. So what we have found at Georgia as we continue to work with our students and in our own work is that as we broaden our perspective and as we include all of those domains, we begin to think more critically and we begin to think more creatively about the questions that we ask and about the actions that we propose. And so with that, what I'm going to do is hand over to Dr. David Gaddy this morning. And what David's going to do is take this outline and animate this discussion with some recent energy data. So David, you're in.
Plans are working okay. Okay, good. Thank you, Josh. And I appreciate everybody being here today. Justin mentioned the fire hose. We'll get to that in just a minute, but I do want to thank Commissioner Pridemore for bringing up the big event of the week, which is not necessarily today, but Monday night. There's maybe everybody's just a little bit of a lull, but there was a pretty significant event Monday night that some of us who actually were at the University of Georgia in 1980 had been waiting for far too long. So it was kind of a kidney stone for the most part that we passed. So we're glad that y'all took the time out, and hopefully y'all have recovered from a pretty late night of Monday night TV and for showing up today. A couple of things that I do want to point out, and I think Justin mentioned it in his comments. We do want to thank the Zoom audience for being here online. There's quite a few people. We understand there's a little hesitancy for getting together in person. We appreciate those that are here today, and thank you for those that are Zooming in. So I'm going to move into, and I do also want to remind us that the folks in Zoom, when we get to them, we're going to have questions, but you can type those in, Laura, to the chat window. Is that right? To the chat window. You can type it in the chat window, and Dean Hour will be moderating those, and we'll have a student worker with us today taking questions from the floor. So just one quick, yeah, there we go. Okay, now I can see where we're going. So a little context. I'm going to give you three upfront slides, a little bit wordy. So an apology that there's going to be some wordy slides up front, and then lots of data, graphics, and information. Then I'm going to close out with two wordy slides. So apologies for the wordy slides up front, pre-game apologies for the two wordy slides, and they matter. So what you can do as we go through this will be available. I think it's being recorded, but the PDF of this will be available. If anybody wants it, we're happy to send this out with all the graphics and all the information. We're happy to share it with you. So I'm going to start back with just a little history. Again, three quick slides, and again, a little bit wordy. Part of what I have picked up on since I've been working with SITS is the context of what we're dealing here with energy policy. If we go back to just after World War II, and I don't think even Commissioner McDonald remembers what was going on during this time. Correct, Commissioner? You remember Secretary Stimson? That's very fortunate that you do, and you're with us today. We're glad you are. Secretary Stimson, Secretary of War during World War II, post-World War II, it was understood that America was in a very different position than it had been prior to World War II. And the question was just simply, what are we going to do with the world that we have just essentially rescued from authoritarian powers? And Stimson's words, which I use as I go around the country and talk about this, were we're simply going to have to deal with the world as it is, not as the way we wish it was. This is one of the themes that we carry forward in what we're doing here in this energy security space that I'm working with Josh and Justin. A little more recent, Bill Burns, Ambassador Burns, who was in the Clinton and Obama administration, recently had some comments before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was also there in that same meeting with Steve Hadley, who served in the Bush administration. Again, you've got a Democrat and Republican coming together talking about the very same issues. And here, Ambassador Burns brings up the issue of great power rivalry, but he points out that we simply currently do not have the diplomatic capacity, as we did back in the Cold War days, to deal with the 21st century issues. And he particularly points out here technology, economics, energy, and climate, right in the wheelhouse of the things that we're talking about here. A more recent, perhaps, article, this came out of the Ronald Reagan Institute. It's a great publication from December 2019. And one of the summary statements here that we are in an era of long-term competition with revisionist powers. And it's a contest for technological superiority. This is a high-stakes competition, particularly as you'll see as we go through this with countries like Russia and China. In the center of this, the report summarizes it as it's a competition between our industrial sector, our innovation bases. I'll mention as we go through this about the U.S. industrial base and the impact of energy policy on that industrial base. But the point here is that these things all culminate in national security issues, which is why we are approaching this from a security-centric framework. So our underlying premise, just a couple of points, that energy is preeminently a resource with intrinsic national security value, but it's not monetized. You're not going to get a bill, an energy bill, that says here's what the national security value of that is. It's somehow embedded in the system. So it's not explicitly accounted for. It's also not just a market commodity, and it's not just a climate change issue. Our contention here is that these things are central to the strength and diversity of our industrial base. When we make these decisions, you'll see here again from the simple graphic, as Josh pointed out, economic, climate, and national security. You're not going to turn the energy policy knob without all three of those responding. So, an overview of what we're going to go through. We're going to talk about some energy and electric power trends, both in the U.S. and Georgia. I'm going to talk about some rates, the energy policy, or energy resources, and some technology comparisons that we think are useful. Then we're going to step up and kind of expand it out to the global energy and CO2 emissions, some data there. And then we're going to talk about global competition and the embedded security implications there. And then we'll have some closing observations. Keep in mind, as Justin pointed out, we're not going to make policy recommendations. We have some back home. This is about information. This is not bringing up policy recommendations or what we think the world ought to be according to us. We just simply want to highlight things that we see as important and hopefully inform policymakers, decision makers in the state of Georgia and the country to inform those decisions better. So here's where we are. Again, it is somewhat of a fire hose, but you can have every one of these graphics when it's over. So U.S. total energy consumption. We'll talk about this energy in two different categories. One is just total energy. That's everything. Transportation, electricity, and heat. That's one lump, total energy. And then we'll parse out, get a little bit deeper into our electric power sector, because our electric power sector is oftentimes in the crosshairs. In fact, things are tending to be more and more electrified. So we'll talk about theirs in a little more detail. You can see the trends. So as we go through these graphics, and as we talk about the U.S., various states, look at other countries, emerging economies across the world, just keep this in mind. You're going to see trends. Lines going up, lines going down, lines flat. And we're going to talk about those in the context of where Georgia is compared with other states, where the U.S. is compared with other countries. So here you'll see, and throughout this, you'll see that hard down tick in the last piece from 2020, or from 2019 to 2020. Everything ticks down on almost all the slides, except in China. Everything is ticking down. Keep in mind that it's coming back up. Even though the fossil fuels are ticking down in the year 2020, it's already predicted, not only in the U.S., but globally, it's coming back up. Here's where the U.S. is. You see the declining coal. For the most part, as we'll get to in just a minute, that's the country's shifting from coal to natural gas. Natural gas is displacing that. I'll have this in a couple of categories, generally non-hydro renewables, typically solar, wind, and some biomass. I'll break those out in a little more detail later, but you can see the trend there. If we look at the electricity profile, severe downturn in coal, uptick in natural gas, nuclear's flat, and we'll get to some of that in just a minute too with regard to Georgia. But oftentimes what's not often understood is that wind is the predominant between solar and wind. Solar gets most of the headlines, but wind is really the kind of the workhorse, and we'll see in a minute from some of the technical comparisons why that is. A couple of things to keep in mind here. We're not picking sides on fuels, energy resources, but there's one thing to keep in mind here. Big difference between coal and gas, two things. One are the carbon emissions. Natural gas is about half what coal is. The other difference is natural gas is a flow resource. We've seen that over the past year. It comes in a pipe. If you have problems upstream, you've got some issues like Texas is dealing with. And you'll see some states that we'll point out here in a minute, as many states are becoming heavily dependent upon natural gas. That's a godsend as far as CO2 emissions go, but there's a base load issue here that we're losing when we shut down these coal plants. And again, it's not a for or against. It is a fact. Base load plants and natural gas, as much as we're going to need those, they are a flow resource. Very busy graph. I apologize. It's a busy graph, busy picture. But what we're trying to demonstrate here and show, and we'll get a little more detail in just a minute, these are the resource portfolios around the country. If you can, and perhaps you can probably see it better on Zoom than you can here, but if you look at the southern states, there tends to be a little more dependency there on natural gas and coal, and as you move around into the northeast states, you start to see coal move out, natural gas move up a little bit. One of the other interesting points here is looking at residential rates. I'll have a couple of graphics here on this in just a minute. These are retail residential rates. Around the country, the U.S. average is about 13.2 cents per kilowatt hour. This is just strictly residential. Kinda, if you look at it, if the region has the word south in it, rate's pretty good. Once you get up into those New England states, you'll notice up in New England, it's 21.2 cents a kilowatt hour. Again, I'll have some more data on particular states in just a minute. Rates are an important issue. The commissioners here in the audience understand that that's, reliability and affordability. You deal with that every day of your term. Couple of, or three actually, resources that I want to highlight. Look at the solar. That's the one that's getting, again, a lot of leaning in on. If we look at the three regions where that is more dominant, it's at the Pacific, up in the mountain, and up in the New England states. We'll look at that in more detail in just a minute. Also, the wind resource, right through that midsection, that west, south, central, particularly dominated by Texas, and up in the west, north, central. If you look up there, wind is almost 30% of their resource portfolio up in that west, north, central. Then we're going to talk about nuclear. I've got those three regions highlighted because I've got some data on nuclear plants up in the Northeast that are critical. So, two graphics on retail residential rates. I've got this broken down into deregulated markets and regulated markets. I am not contending that this is causal. This is not a reason for. These are correlations. The black dotted line there is the U.S. average for residential rates, which we saw earlier was about 13 cents a kilowatt hour. In the deregulated markets, the rates tend to be higher. They're also a little more noisy, a little variable. If we shift, and I'm going to notice I keep the y-axis is the same, 5 to 25. So the U.S. line is going to stay fixed. We switch over to the regulated markets, and you'll see the states are a little tighter, less volatile, and generally lower than the U.S. average. Georgia is there. Georgia is there. Need a little help on the audio, on the video. There we go. Georgia's there in the red dotted line. Consistently since 2000 has been below U.S. average. Let's look at the wind and solar that I pointed out earlier on that region, on that U.S. map. Wind, Again, it was the largest of the two between solar and wind. Wind generation 2020 in the U.S., 74% of it came from 9 states. You'll see there that Texas is up at about 27%. 27% of wind generation in the country comes out of one state of Texas. It's no big surprise when you look at the wind resource map there. The black stars are the states that I had listed just before. It's located near the resource. It's logical. It makes sense. If we shift over now and look at the solar resource, about 77% of U.S. solar comes from 9 states, different 9 states, except California and Texas are included in both categories. But you'll notice here of total U.S. solar, about 36 or 7% of it is from the state of California. Notice Georgia is on this figure. And if we look at the resource, excuse me, ma'am, I got it. Thank you, Laura. 4 of those states are out in the Southwest where there is considerable solar resource. But when you look at the 3 states on the East Coast, that is a representation of good policy, calculated policy. North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, the resource is very available. It's there, but it's much more calculated as it's being brought into the state portfolio. So while the resource is not as dense as it is out in the Midwest states, nonetheless, states like North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, by sound policy, are moving in that direction. This is the nuclear figure that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you've kept up or have any social media feed and pay attention to what's going on with nuclear power, this is one of those major issues in the country. It's a major issue around the world. This is where we spend a good bit of time in our group. Folks like Justin and Josh, who come from a background of proliferation-focused issues. I'm coming at it from a civilian nuclear angle. We are shutting down nuclear plants in the country. So the way this is broken up, I've got 3 categories still on the left: retired reactors, planned retired reactors, and then the bottom row there are reactors that were planned to be shut down, but apparently the engineers stepped into the room and said, you know, if you do that, it's going to be a problem. So state action stepped in and said, we're going to have to put that on hold. We have 11 reactors in the U.S. that have been retired since 2013. 8 are planned, but if I bring up this, the figure gets updated regularly. We've actually lost one of those. Indian Point 3 was shut down last April. 4 reactors in Illinois were recently preserved by state action. And the remaining state action states, again, the blue highlighted area here, all deregulated markets, every one of them, a deregulated market. So let's look at Georgia, just some data on Georgia, and we'll do some comparisons with other states as well. This is Georgia's total energy. Again, everything, electricity, transportation, and heat. We're what most states are. We're high in petroleum, primarily because of transportation. Coal's down ticking, natural gas is up ticking, nuclear. Again, I'll get to the power sector in just a second. Biomass is pretty strong. This is all energy, everything. And solar, you'll see, is our other resource that's on the uptick there. If we shift and just look at our electric power industry, this is everything that generates electricity in the state of Georgia. And I've got our rates here. Georgia's right now for 2020 is about 12.02 cents a kilowatt hour. You'll see again what we saw earlier on the U.S. slide. Coal's going down, natural gas is ticking up. If you get out to the end of that nuclear line, sometime later this year and on into next year, we're going to bring Plant Vogtle online, and we're going to have some base load help there as Georgia shifts away from coal, and perhaps in the next RP, there may be even further advances in that space. That base load power with those 2 reactors is going to be an important asset to the state economy. But again, here again, you see solar is our renewable resource. We look at emissions, and again, a lot of what's driving the conversation in the U.S. is carbon emissions, climate change issues. Georgia's CO2 emissions, and I'll actually get later and look at the U.S., and we'll put this in a broader context. Georgia's CO2 emissions for its electric power sector in 2020 is at a level prior to 1990. And primarily that has been maybe some reduction in demand, but primarily from offsetting coal with natural gas plants. Now we'll look at some others. So what I did was I looked at the top 8 GDPs. Georgia's about number 8 in the country. So we picked out a few states, some neighboring states, and then looked up at some others to see what's going on in other regions around the world. This is Florida, and I've spent a good bit of time in Florida over the past couple of years. Good rates, 11.27 cents kilowatt hour. But look at their portfolio. Coal, as in most states, is on the decline. Florida's sitting at about 76% natural gas. And whenever I'm down there, the folks in South Florida always say that is a long, bendy pipe from the Gulf to get gas to these gas plants. That's a concern. They are very vulnerable to upstream natural gas supplies, very weather dependent at that point. If we look at Texas, and we could have an entire outlook on the state of Texas. They've had a tough year. You'll see what they're doing. They're retiring coal plants and they are replacing that. You can see almost every time a coal plant starts to shut down, there's an uptick in natural gas. Texas is offsetting their coal retirements with not only natural gas, but also wind power. It's not a right or wrong. It's what Texas is doing. Being in a deregulated market like they are, they've had some issues with regard to some reserve capacities in Texas. Wind is not quite the reserve resource that something like natural gas is or coal is. We look at New York, again, a very unique state with regard to its energy policy because it is strongly driven towards carbon emission reduction. You can see here again, coal's almost non-existent. What is it? I don't even think I have it on the figure here. They have actually retired Indian Point 2 nuclear reactor, and you can see exactly what happened when they did it. They had to supplement that, backfill it with natural gas. This is not a right or wrong or anything about disparaging about New York. It is just simply their state policy. Not perhaps what we want to do in Georgia, not perhaps what they want to do in Florida either. But also note, New York's rates there are 18.3 cents kilowatt hour. National average is 13. California, we can have 2 energy outlooks on this one. Natural gas is essentially their lone remaining, traditional resource. They're tacking hard into the wind of carbon reduction. They're even shutting down nuclear reactors. I think they've got one left at Diablo Canyon, and it's set to retire. It was on that list earlier in just a couple of years. One thing to note here, it's in a very small line there at the bottom of the table. California imports 30% of their in-state consumption. They only generate in-state 70% of what the state consumes. They import the rest. 20.4 cents per kilowatt hour. Then we look at Illinois. I've got it up here because they are the largest nuclear consumer in the country. Coal's declining. They are struggling up there again with climate-centric energy policy for the state, even looking at retiring nuclear, going mostly renewable. And you can see the tough slog they've got here. Coal plants are retiring. They had to step in for, with those 4 reactors to ensure that the nuclear plants stayed open so that they could just keep the lights on. A lot of wind, though, up there. They're bringing that online. Now, those trends that we just saw in those states and what we saw around the region of the world, they've got some rationale for it. So this is a little bit of maybe the technical engineering geeky part of this, not too much. But I want to just quickly pass through about 7 figures that are all going to look like this. Every one of them, just different colors and different technologies. And capacity factor is something we use in engineering. It's what the power sector uses regularly. It is simply a measure of the percent time or the fraction of time that an asset is generating electricity. So I'm going to lay out for the year 2020 each of the various technologies and what those capacity factors are for each month. We're not going to go through each month, but I've got at the top here capacity factor for the year, normalized. You can see here residential solar. Generally it peaks sometime in the summer, which is what you would expect. Very low capacity factor at the tail ends here in the winter. But for the year, it's about 19%. This is generally what you get from things like rooftop solar. It's not a ding or a positive or negative. It's a technology fact. We bump this up to utility scale solar. The capacity factor, you can see here, there's a little bit more economy of scale, a little more capturing of that solar resource as the monthly capacity factors increase individually, and that annual capacity factor goes up from 19 to 20, almost 25%. This is why Georgia is moving very calculatedly into this space here. It's a good resource. Move into it carefully. Then we look at wind. This is again the predominant of the two between solar and wind. Annual capacity factor about 35%. Notice that across the year, a little less volatile. It's a little more consistent. Peaks at a different time of the year, but it's not as, kind of sine wave looking as solar. It's not a plus or minus, for or against, right or wrong. It's just how the technology works and how the resource provides. U.S. coal, capacity factor is 40%. 10 years ago, the annual capacity factor for coal was in the 60s. We were burning coal. Gas comes in. This is a low capacity factor now based on history simply because natural gas has outcompeted it for rates until the end of this past year. Natural gas rates went up. Coal started coming back on because it was more economical. But the capacity factor for coal is declining slowly because we're simply stranding those assets. It's not a right or wrong. It's just a reality. Hydro, we're not going to build any more of these. We may use some existing sorts of dams to do some things, but I wanted to put this in here because this is still, I think we've got 100 years worth of hydro in the state of Georgia. It's about 40%. But this is the one this is the horse right now in the country. This is the one, due to fracking, hydraulic fracturing, unlocking all those natural gas resources, this is what has come to the rescue for the U.S. electric power industry, particularly with regard to carbon emissions. If we're going to shut down those coal plants, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build natural gas, combined cycle. We get those efficiencies up close to 50%. This is a great technology, and the resource is plentiful. I understand their CO2 emissions. I get that. But again, economic security, climate security, national security, reliability is still at the front of the race. And then nuclear, 92.4%, stuff just runs. Turn it on, flip switch, just runs. Now let's back up. Let's look at, we've talked about the U.S., we've talked about Georgia. Let's look at this in the bigger picture. Again, if we're going to deal with our U.S. energy sector and our U.S. power sector in any terms related to things like security and climate and economics, we need to put this, as my first slide pointed out, relative to the world. In 1944, as much as Henry Stimson saw the U.S. in the world, we are far more deeply embedded in global issues today than we ever have been, and perhaps more vulnerable than we ever have been. This is energy and CO2 emissions globally. Two lines, total energy, CO2 emissions increasing. Downtick last year, maybe one of the take-home lessons there is if you want to reduce CO2 emissions, you just shut down your economy and you'll get CO2 emissions, they'll decline. They're coming back up. Energy consumption's coming back up, CO2 emissions are coming back up. Based on 2021 data, we'll see the uptick. If we look at the resource portfolio here, again, think about this in terms of if we're going to design energy policy with a particular 83% fossil fuels. That is a heavy lift when we talk about things like decarbonizing an economy. That is tough. That's a lot of energy. I've got it broken down here into non-hydro renewables for a reason that we'll get to. If we look at it strictly as the electricity sector, we're 61% fossil fuels. And you can see here natural gas is really on the uptick. Nuclear is generally flat, and wind globally is the one that's still, just like it is in the U.S., carrying a lot of the weight. And again, I'm fixing to go through some slides that are going to point to where this is happening. It is not an indictment on these countries or these regions. So I'll tell you straight up front, if I were in charge of these countries, I do what these countries have done to meet their economic needs. So we are pointing these things out in order to put it in context, to put the U.S. in context. In the Asia Pacific region, this is where over 50% of the world lives. This is where 45% of global energy consumption is, and that is 35% of global GDP. There are no projections for any of those to start declining anytime soon in that region. Things are going to continue to increase. Notice North America and Europe, older economies, flat. Look at CO2 emissions. This looks like the previous. It's where 52% of CO2 emissions are out of the Asia Pacific. It's not right or wrong. It's just they are simply consuming fossil fuels because they work. Again, North America and Europe, CO2 emissions are going down. A little more detail, I took out of the Asia Pacific region, China and India. Just took them out because they're dominant. And you look at the same figures, and you see here that this is almost common knowledge that China is emitting most of the CO2 emissions in the world right now. It's mainly, look at that uptick in where you see that red line start to suddenly go up. That's when China joined the World Trade Organization and said, oh God, we're going to have an economy over here. And they did. And they started burning coal. U.S. and Europe CO2 emissions are declining. If we look at U.S. CO2 emissions, again, right now in 2020, this is total CO2 emissions. We're at about 1983 levels. That was right after we won the national championship. And that's when Herschel Walker left the University of Georgia and went to play football for the New Jersey Generals. The U.S. CO2 emissions, 13.9% of the global. Emissions are going down in the U.S. U.S. power sector CO2 emissions, which oftentimes are in the center of CO2 emissions, we're at somewhere before 1990 levels for U.S. total power, electric power. U.S. electric power accounts for about 32% of U.S. total CO2 emissions and about 5% of global. Now let's look at it. The last 21 years, since the turn of the century, the millennium, since China joined the WTO, and there have been about 8,320 million metric tons of carbon emitted, and you see where it's coming from. Yeah, you can see that better. I can't see it on my screen a little bit, but you see about 6,500, which is, gosh, that's over 3/4, is from China. India is revving up. You'll see the other countries there. But in Europe and the U.S., it's in decline. And there are reasons for that. We'll talk about a little bit more with some graphs coming up. But these are older economies. They've been around for a long time. They've got their base established. They've industrialized. Their industrial base is solid. We can tinker around and reduce CO2 emissions. These economies that are emerging and trying to get traction and trying to get an economy developed and get people working, and as Justin pointed out in his opening, get people fed, they're going to use what works. Let's just take the U.S. completely off the map. Overnight, U.S. emissions are taken. You'll see the black line there is the U.S. CO2 global emission trend I mentioned earlier. The dotted line there is if you just took the U.S. out. What that does is it sets 2020 emissions back to about 2004 levels. That's a plus. How to do that's a different matter. But the thing is, the trajectory continues to increase. This is only putting it in context when we're talking about decarbonizing the U.S. economy. What do we gain? And this is what we would gain. Now, all of this energy resources, energy technologies, and the U.S. deciding what it's going to use in the 21st century. Let's look at some of the impacts. Because again, first 3 slides, the world as it is, there are industrial-based innovation challenges, competition for technological superiority in these resources. So when the U.S. decides to do something with its energy portfolio, there are going to be global impacts. And there are also going to be impacts coming in our direction globally. So let's look at fossil fuels. Similar to what I put up earlier, this is where the fossil fuels are being consumed. Again, it's in those emerging economies. That looks redundant, but it kind of tees it up for where we want to go. If we look at the top 22 emerging markets that financial folks in the U.S. look to for investment overseas, we've got 22 emerging markets. China and India are two of them. The other 20, I didn't put them up individually. Just notice, as I mentioned earlier, the trends and the directions that they're going. They are consuming more fossil fuels. Question is going to be, where are they going to get it? The U.S. looking at decarbonizing, getting off of fossil fuels, cutting back, whatever that may be. These countries are moving in the direction of more fossil fuels for good reason. Well, here's one of their providers, one of them that's chomping at the bit to do exactly that. Russia, in the news almost every day. We're in deliberations with them right now. But Russian oil and gas, and again, keep in mind as we talk about these competitors, what are they likely to do with their fossil fuel trends within the broader context of something so important as global climate change? Well, Russia's exports are 50% oil and gas. They represent 12.5% of global oil production. You see the numbers here. LNG gas production, and Europe is becoming increasingly dependent upon gas coming out of Russia. Nord Stream 2 is the most recent example. If you look at Russia, and I brought this in, this is a production to consumption ratio, and I'll have two graphs. One is oil. The little dotted line is 1, which means we are producing exactly as much as we're consuming. For oil, you see Russia is way up there, 3.5, 4 times more production than consumption is a significant part of their GDP. The U.S. for oil, we're just about to get back up to the 1 line. China is now has market leverage as a major consumer of oil. If we look at natural gas, the U.S. has actually upticked across that production to consumption line. China's still a major consumer, so they're very dependent on imports. And Russia is now really trying to work hard to compete with the U.S. in the natural gas space. Again, keep in mind, what is Russia going to do with these fossil fuel resources that its economy is so dependent upon, as are emerging markets? We shift back and look at China and their dependency. They consume about 26% of the world's total energy and about the same amount percentage-wise of the world's fossil fuels. Their economy, a little quick figure in a minute, 84% is fossil fuels, and over half of that is coal. I want to bring up just 3 quick policies China has. Made in China 2025 and their last year's 14th five-year plan. You don't have to imply anything. Read it explicitly. They are going to develop coal, oil, and gas. Coal, oil, and gas. They're also going to develop renewables, batteries, nuclear. Closing slide I'll have in just a minute is they're going all in on every energy resource and technology that we have. They have an industrial policy that is geared towards being technologically superior in this space. They even have an Arctic policy, and aren't even an Arctic state, that they're going to promote oil and gas drilling there. This is China's total energy portfolio, mostly coal, 84% fossil fuel. Now, it would be easy for us to talk about China being the bad guy here, but again, if you're in charge of trying to feed and employ 1.4 billion people, you're going to use what works. Civilian nuclear power. 3 quick slides here. And again, think about this in terms of the direction that the U.S. is taking, the direction that other countries are taking. This is nuclear reactor construction starts since the early 70s. You'll see up till the year 2000, the U.S. dominated this space. Russia was coming on you can see there in the 70s and 80s, but at the turn of the century, it belongs to Russia and China. We have 2 reactor construction starts that are ongoing. This is not counting VC Summer up in South Carolina, and that's here in our state of Georgia, Vogtle. China and Russia own this market. If we look at since 2000, reactors connected to the grid and reactors under construction. There have been 155 of those, and 105 are associated with China, Russia. Again, it's not good guy, bad guy thing. It's just what countries do when they're looking to become the dominant player in a market. This slide, again, I've shown this slide many times. It's one of my favorite slides, I guess, because it contrasts the trends here. The blue line there is U.S. nuclear power, and if we allow our current nuclear fleet and all the reactors to retire after a normal 60-year lifespan, and many of those are going to retire earlier if we don't step in, then you'll see that somewhere along about the year 2030, we start having a downtick. Two problems. We don't have a plan for how to backfill that much reliable baseload, zero carbon electricity. We don't have a plan for that. The other thing that we don't have here is what I've got highlighted as countries like China and Russia increase their nuclear expertise. Ours is declining. Back in the 40s and 50s, when this technology was being developed, it would have been unheard of for anyone then to think that the U.S. was going to be outcompeted in the single most energy-dense resource on Earth and probably one of the most critical national security technologies on the planet. That asymmetry, meaning we're going in one direction and a competitor, great power competitor, is going in another, that's an issue. Let's look at renewables. And it is true, we hear often, this is going to be one of the future things in the U.S. that the U.S. needs to continue to work hard towards. But the phrase is generally renewables are growing exponentially, and anybody with a little bit of math can see that they are growing exponentially. The issue here is, again, to put some pragmatic context to it, is if we look at world energy consumption for non-hydro renewables in context with fossil fuels, the gap isn't closing. The point here is renewables aren't displacing fossil fuels, as we saw earlier with the emerging markets. They're increasing, but they're not necessarily displacing. So from a climate carbon issue here, not only does that gap need to close, that gap needs to be reversed. Pragmatically and realistically, that is one heavy lift. I've got some numbers, get a little thing here. This is showing 2021 projections. The fossil fuel consumption is, again, already projected to increase. That gap there is just an indicator of the uphill climb that we've got if we're going to turn to renewables only. In China, that gap is increasing further. They are growing gangbusters, their solar PV world, and wind and batteries, but they are also continuing to burn fossil fuels. If we look at those emerging markets that we talked about earlier, again, they've got a downtick here for 2020, but they too are going in the same direction as China. They are going in the same direction as Russia. Now, why is that? Why is that happening? Again, this is not a causal statement. But let's just look at the two resources here, solar and wind, two resources where that exponential curve that I had up here earlier, where is that happening? Well, I've got a busy table that I have highlighted 3 boxes that I want you to look at. For 2020, 10 countries over here on the left represent 80% of the global share of solar generation in the world. These 10 countries, lower left, little red box, 79.9% of solar generation comes from those 10 countries. If you look over on the far right box, those 10 countries represent 2/3 of global GDP. Those countries, they have significant resources, financial resources. But more importantly, perhaps, is that middle red box. These countries have when you look at their electric power sector energy portfolio, they are significantly stacked with fossil fuels, nuclear, and hydro. I think the lowest one on here, if I glance through it, is Germany, and up to India. They have a substantial traditional resource base in fossil fuels, nuclear and hydro, that they can then come in and build solar on top of it. It makes all the sense in the world why most of that exponential growth, 80% of it, is coming from these 10 well-established industrial economies as far as their energy base goes. If we switch over to the wind, it's a different 10 countries, but you still see the same trend. 80% of it is from those 10 countries. They represent about 62% of global GDP. And again, the resource base for their power sector is very well established in fossil fuels, nuclear, and hydro. What we also know, this has been something that the Trump administration started and the Biden administration has continued, that we have got to look at the supply chain for the rare earths, metals, and minerals that are going to stand up a renewable industry, solar, wind, batteries, down the line. What we also know is that we are a little bit late to the game. President Biden had an executive order last year to look at the security implications and issues of that supply chain. Some of the things that have come out of that are that, China's been in this game a long time. They have been strategizing around rare earths and metals for 15, 20, 25 years. You can see here from this top left one for lithium-ion battery production, upstream, midstream, and downstream, they're the dominant global market player. You can see in the top right figure where the U.S. is getting most of its mineral commodities. One of those countries is that really dark maroon red one out there, China. And that lower right, which is where China is really dominating the market, is in the solar PV supply chain. The red parts of those circles is, again, China dominant. This is all in line with their foreign policy from the days of Xi Jinping has been the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially to connect China's factories to markets across Eurasia. Again, not a right or wrong thing, but this is who we're competing against. And this is who emerging markets are turning to for energy and energy technology. So what we've got here in my closing last few slides is a contrast in perspective. The U.S. here, generally we see energy as a market commodity or a climate issue. In China and Russia, their state-owned enterprises, which is where their energy, including coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, owned by the state, money or market prices and things like that aren't necessarily top of the list. To them, energy and energy technologies are instruments of national power to achieve geopolitical objectives. This is what we're working with on the global scale. So if we look at that world map, and again, this is the map that over the past 10 years has kind of come to me as being pretty dang important. We see gas in the top left, coal in the bottom left, oil in the top right, and nuclear. This is a global network of energy interdependencies. The question is, how are we going to be engaged in that? Particularly with those emerging markets, those developing economies that are looking for partners to stand up their economies. So if you think about it in terms of what the U.S. is trying to do, what Russia and China are doing in the fossil fuel, nuclear, and renewable space, it almost looks like a military pincer move in Europe and Asia. And the question would be, what is the U.S. doing to respond to that? Closing observations and then closing questions. This is the last two slides that I told you would be busy, and I apologize. I'll print these out. I'll come to your house and read them to you if you want to. I tell students don't ever do what I'm fixing to do, but I'm gonna move down through these. China and Russia are strategically exploiting fossil fuel resources, and the U.S. is moving away from them. Again, it's not a right or wrong. It's a fact. And developing economies are moving in the same direction as Russia and China. Now, as the U.S. transitions away from fossil fuels, it is going to reduce the diversity of our resources and technologies in our industrial base. It is. It's going to reduce it. China and Russia at the same time are expanding and diversifying theirs. China and Russia are dominating civilian nuclear exports. We're trying to revive ours, and we are working to keep existing plants open. In our American Nuclear Innovation Act that was passed last year, we're really working hard in the SMR space. I've spent time out in Wyoming where we're going to develop the first molten salt cooled reactor out there. Not we, Bill Gates is. I'm going to go out there and just talk about it. Small modular, actually that's not small, it's an advanced reactor. We're moving in that direction, we are. But we got a lot of ground to make up on how to do it. China is currently the dominant force in global solar PV batteries and rare earths. And again, this last bullet that I alluded to earlier, our great power competitors are in an all the above energy and technology strategy, and they are leveraging state-owned enterprises to meet their geopolitical objectives. That's a tough competitor there. Some security questions.
If we disengage
from fossil fuels and we don't aggressively promote nuclear, is this going to shift geopolitical advantage in the energy space to China and Russia? And those emerging economies, as they need reliable low carbon energy, will they be vulnerable to the geopolitics of the provider nations? As we here in the U.S. shift toward renewables and a greater dependency on supply chains, global supply chains, what impact is that going to have on our energy security? Am I muted? Should I shut up? Okay. I'm about done, so you can mute me in a minute. Okay. And in closing, what will be the impact on our national security if our industrial base is moving in a different direction than those of our competitors? Last little bullet. Maybe perhaps we want to look at how we can engage our allies in these last few, natural gas combined cycle, advanced nuclear, renewables, all those things. We saw those technology comparisons. The world is waiting for those. Perhaps there's a opportunity. I'm going to be done now. These are the necessary security spaces that we are proposing need to be maintained to maybe look at this from a security-centric, climate-inclusive framework. So I'm going to close there. I think I hit my end time bang on the dot, 1:10, and I'm going to open this up for questions. If there are any questions from the floor, I'll take those. The online questions, Dean Hour is going to take those online. So if anybody has any questions, we're happy to respond if we can. Okay? Commissioner McDonald from the floor. We got a young lady come here with a microphone, Commissioner.
I don't think I need it.
I doubted it. But you're not going to sing, are you going to sing?
David,
Yes, sir.
you've talked about things that are right and things that are wrong. You're not saying either one of them is right.
I have my opinions.
That's what I'm getting to ask.
Yes, sir.
What is the biggest issue that this nation faces today that's wrong about national energy policy, and where does it come?
You're asking me that question. You don't want me to deflect that thing over here to one of my. So, Commissioner, this is me speaking to you. And this is a personal response. This is not a University of Georgia position. I think if we go back to some of the things we talked about earlier, our conversation about energy in this country is generally driven by, is it cheap? That is a market issue. Or what are the climate impacts? At the national level, that's our DC conversation, pretty much in a nutshell. If you chase price, you get Texas. If you chase carbon reduction, you get California. So I would contend, Commissioner, that one of the issues first is the conversation is not being brokered with the general public in a healthy way at all. In addition, we are going to have to accept, as Josh pointed out earlier, that there are going to be some pain. There's pain coming. If we want all these things, it's actually going to cost something. So I'm going to say that the hardest or the most difficult or the troubling part here is it's a bad conversation that we're having. It's not brokered well. I don't think we have a technology problem. I think we have a supply chain problem. But this country is not going to be outcompeted or out-innovated. It's a question of whether or not we're going to be able to accept, perhaps, that we're going to need every energy resource we got in the country to not only provide reliable electricity, but affordable electricity, and keep it in the context of the world. Now, Commissioner, I'll be happy to volley back. I did the best I could. You won't like my answer, do you?
I want one issue. Where does the buck stop? What happens when Russia turns the valve off on natural gas for Europe?
We get a good lesson on energy policy here in the U.S. Well, I'll look over there. So that's part of, it's a struggle, Commissioner, having a conversation in the U.S. about what goes on in other countries, because it's almost that's going on in other countries. As part of what we're trying to do with this program is educate students that actually what goes on in other countries, it does matter here now. What happens to Europe's economy, their reliability, their security, it does impact us. We are not an island anymore. I actually have a long list of things but we can. I'll talk with you about those. But the question is well understood, and it is just not easy to respond. We need a long, hard drink of coffee on this one. I didn't say liquor. I said coffee. All right. Any other questions from the floor? Where are we? Oh, yes. Could you give me your name right quick? I identified your elderly statesman to the left. I should have.
I am Jeffrey Michael. I am a former student of Dr. Gaddy's.
Well, dang, when did you slip in here?
I know, man. So 2 questions. First, in one of your graphs talking about solar energy throughout the U.S., you had in parentheses some numbers, and they varied pretty wildly. And I'm curious what they mean.
Nice spot. I only had that
You
question.
taught me everything.
I'm going to tell you real quickly.
Okay.
So in those values, I had a column with solar and then a parenthetical, and what that was is separating out utility scale from rooftop. Okay. So that was the difference, to keep it separate.
Okay.
Good answer?
Yeah, definitely suffices. And then my last question is, in one of your other graphs, petroleum, it was clear. It had some fluctuation, but from a trend perspective, since the 90s, has been rather steady.
Where?
In the U.S.
Yeah.
Why?
Efficiency. Efficiency.
Vehicle efficiency,
Yeah.
because that's where our, okay.
Yeah. And again, that comes down on the side of the impact
Policy.
of technology. Yeah. Well, impact of technology, what innovation can do there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's a lot of that is efficiency. It's
okay.
Efficiency related. Fair enough?
That's it.
Fair enough. Okay. Any questions from the floor? Dean, do we have anybody online? Some chat stuff in there. I don't know if there are any questions or.
Yeah, we do. And folks, if you have questions online, please send those through the Q&A. I think the chat is probably disabled because this is a webinar. We do have some questions, Professor Gaddy. Here's one. I was wondering about your thoughts on distributed energy resources, DERs, especially things like solar community microgrids, and what role they can play in improving the U.S.'s energy security.
So we are, so a little bit of background. We've actually worked on solar demonstration projects on campus. I guess I need to turn back here and look, not answer Dean. We've worked on solar projects on campus. This is actually something we're pretty deeply interested in, on how to maximize the utility of distributed energy. So the way I'll sum it up, if you'll go back and just recall those capacity factors for rooftop solar, and maybe as it bumps up to community, gets a little bit higher, utility scale even higher. Some of the things that we are interested in is maximizing that rooftop and the smaller scale solar distributed resources by coupling those perhaps with battery technology. One of the issues is when, and you know, that is when demand is up, oftentimes solar is not, or when solar's up, the demand is down. How can we actually capture that solar generation and store it, perhaps in something like EVs or in some utility scale, or maybe distributed battery storage, so that we can call on that, and is take that solar resource and make it a callable, dispatchable resource using the battery technology. So I'll give you a personal flip on that. I'm more of a proponent of thinking about it as distributed battery storage, with solar feeding into the batteries distributed around at any time the solar resource is available. So I think the distributed energy resource is one thing, but I think also we should keep in mind that the distributed battery storage, when homes have batteries, that perhaps a utility or a community operator can dump the excess solar into the battery storage, it essentially becomes a callable resource at that point. But this distributed energy is going to be one of those topics we're going to be talking about for a long time. It's going to be a critical resource, critical technology for us to really to get right, to maximize the resource and make sure that it doesn't create cross subsidies for customers that don't use it.
Do you anticipate more corporations getting into clean energy alternatives like solar? So for example, Facebook's facility in Newton County.
I'm not only going to get into it more, they are already getting into it more. I think one of the, and this is one thing, maybe Commissioner, back to your point, this is one of those conversations that you like to broker with the public, because when a Facebook or a Google or whoever, an Amazon comes in, they want 100% renewable. You know, it's pretty tough unless they're going to put a facility on site with battery storage to provide that for them. You can't just cut them out of the grid. So there are ways that we're going to need to have this conversation with the general public as to how we can provide 100% of their demand as renewable, but it's not going to be directly tied to that facility in particular. So I think this is going to be where a lot of the pressure is going to come from renewables, is going to be from the corporate world. I see a lot of that pushing hard.
In terms of energy infrastructure, how does the infrastructure bill help Georgia?
The emphasis, I'll say this, the emphasis on EVs, I think, is something that can help Georgia. I'm not going to necessarily say that there's something in there in particular that will. I think there are some pieces in there that can. And I think the key piece there is going to be the president's push for essentially a national network of charging stations. I think that's where some of it can, because we've got industry coming into Georgia, you know, dead set on building batteries here, manufacturing. So I think that can help us not only energy-wise, but also economically.
Our economy doesn't use energy very efficiently by a variety of measures. How does energy conservation play a role in Georgia's energy future? Where's the best bang for the buck in this area?
I don't know if I can attest to what the best bang for the buck is. I think that, again, not to be redundant here on EVs, but you know, the efficiency of an EV, an electric vehicle, is certainly better than it is for an internal combustion engine. So I think long term, when that resource consumption shifts over from distributed individuals driving cars to a centralized plant, perhaps it's burning something like nuclear, natural gas, and renewables. I think we're going to see some efficiencies at that point. It's just probably not going to be the kind that we are going to necessarily sense at the individual level. I think it'll be more of a community metric.
What percentage of China's CO2 emissions can be blamed on rich countries shipping factories there?
I don't know. I've heard, I don't know what that number is. I don't have that value offhand. I know that there's a value out there, but I don't have the answer. We got a question right here. Megan is wearing her very comfortable shoes, she said today, so she had to make that run.
Hey, Dr. Gaddy.
Hey.
Chase Duncan, also one of your students. But we've talked, in our research stuff about U.S. utilities looking to others' battery storage to get away from this whole supply chain issue that you bring up with China. But even if we were to be able to do that and get away from lithium-ion batteries, how can utilities deal with the sheer amount of rare earth minerals that are required for building, wind and solar without being reliant on China? Or is that something we're just going to have to?
So I don't think we're going to, and again, you've probably heard the phrase about decoupling from China. It's a meme right now. Not going to happen, I don't think, particularly in any early stages of, to your point, Chase, about the rare earths and metals going to stand up a renewable energy. We can't just rest on that. We're going to certainly have to leverage our allies in how to offset that dependency in a more secure, democratically friendly area. So it's a good question, and I think this is something, if you went up to DC and asked any Democrat or Republican, they're going to come together and say, probably one of the biggest issues we're dealing with right now is that very question you're asking. How do we strategically move away, offset, still understanding that we're going to have some dependency on China? A little bit of dependency is some leverage, at least. But I think to answer your question directly, we're going to need a new network of allied partnerships there. Okay.
You don't have to bring the microphone.
I am for the Zoom.
Yeah, they have to, can't hear.
Or they won't.
Yeah.
They won't hear you.
I haven't heard mention of geothermal as part of a resource. Can you just brush on it real quick and maybe where you see it stands in the future?
That is actually a great resource. We don't have any over here, but out west, it's really the sleeper, I think. I think the issue with it, Jeffrey, is just not the low-hanging fruit right now, but that is an opportunity waiting to happen, particularly out west where they have that resource.
It does chip away at our baseload problem.
It really does. Yeah, it does. So I was informed that's the last question. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dean Hour. Yeah, right. Yep. Turn it over to Dean Hour to close up shop here.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to especially thank Dr. David Gaddy and Josh Massey for mapping this important landscape of energy security issues and noting some of the ways that the University of Georgia is clarifying and adding precision to some of the policy research in this area. Special thank you to Commissioner Pridemore for her contributions today. And finally, thank you to Megan Gherkin, Laura Bain, Sarah Baines for helping put on this special meeting, which has its logistical challenges, care of COVID, with the online audience and the in-person audience, and a special thanks to the team here at the Sloppy Floyd building. We want to make sure that you'll stick around and join us for other events, not today, but moving forward. So we've got some great upcoming events just to quickly tell you about. We hope all of you will consider joining us on February 1 for our 10th annual 2022 Georgia Legislative Outlook, which will feature Speaker David Ralston at Troutman Pepper. Details for joining us either in person or online are on our website now. And we look forward to seeing you in person or virtually for that important event. And then please be on the lookout for future communications regarding our programs and opportunities to get more involved. And then finally, go Dogs. Thank you.